This is another episode of Thorin's Platform, and my guest for this one is going to be Sam W. Delorme. You may have seen his work on Action Esports, or on ESPN, or more recently on HTC. So we know that he's getting money now, finally. He's no longer purely dancing for pennies in front of us, as we all, I would say, applaud, but sadly, this is not the sort of community in which that is this kind of behavior. More like just demand dance faster and better, but not for any more money. You know, but now he is getting more money. So this piece that you wrote was back on your old stomping grounds of Action Esports, and the piece was titled, "What Can North Do to Break Through?" And it still wasn't that long ago. It was less than a month ago. It was on December 9th that you published this. Now, I've done myself a lot of content on the team of North. I've even done other Thorin's platforms regarding the team, because I feel like this is the team that I think shows the biggest contrast between how fans see people and how analysts and people who basically dedicate their lives to trying to watch and understand Counter-Strike at as high a level as each person within their own limitations can, how differently you can perceive teams. Because to fans, a lot of fans get really pissed off with experts and analysts, actually, for they think hyping up North. What they see is, when they see North, they see a team that was always just like average, you know. I think in a fan's mind, North was always the 8th place team, and they just sometimes had a slightly better result, and sometimes they had a very, very mildly worse result. But for them, they never really were a legit top 5 team or a team that ever could have won big events, you know. And for them, you know, 8% last year was one big outlier, never to be repeated again. Now, first of all, I've obviously spent a lot of my own content, I would say, deconstructing that myth, or that, I think, like, very limited narrative, because first of all, you can see they have had numerous top 4s and they've made finals of tournaments, and it's not some sort of hype. They really have had times where they had very wide map pool, or where some of their players were very good, or where they had elements to their style that, either in terms of just the current meta or specific opponents, crucially, allowed them to be a team where you could actually have imbued them with hope that maybe they would go further, would become a top level team. As actually, I think the good analogy right now would be the current Astralis, because current Astralis, yeah, they're probably not going to win many tournaments, and they don't look like they're going to be the #1 team, but they're very solid, and you can expect them to be top 4, and you can expect them to have a deep map pool, and you can expect them to do a lot of good things. And sure, you're not #1 and #2, but you're pretty fucking good as #3 and #4. So the problem is the gulf between why North isn't that sort of a team and the pieces they have now does seem to be largely one in which there's no obvious answer. And that's why I think so many analysts, so many experts, so many journalists write so much about them and think so much about them, because it's not an easy nut to crack. It seems pretty tough. So in your piece, you address what is an obvious way to potentially fix this, which is to make roster moves. Because the good thing about roster moves is, first of all, sometimes you remove a player who in some sense was a problem, not necessarily as a player, but maybe just in your team, and that immediately fixes the problem because the problem isn't there anymore. So that always will be obviously the go-to easy way to do it. So one of the reasons why I wanted to ask initially why roster moves is because North is a team where, even though they they've definitely given like enough time to all these different lineups. It's not like they're a team who chops and changes overnight or after every major, you know. But are they a team that has necessarily changed things within their team beyond roster moves? Like, what's your take on that?
I think they have changed quite a bit. I think that over time they've become significantly more dynamic than they were before. If you go back like a year or two, when they still had Dig, they were still on Dig, and they had Kirby and stuff like that. It was their game. Their strengths were significantly weaker. They were not nearly as polished as they are now in their executes. MSL has become probably the best in-game leader when it comes to crafting executes. There are some things that haven't changed, and that is concerning. And to me, that says that we have to consider changing the in-game leader. Now, I didn't end up in the article saying that you should, but that becomes a possibility, because it does seem that the more it changes, the more it stays the same with North. Their weaknesses have become slightly less obvious, I think. Sure. Their strengths have become much stronger than they were before. They're a much better team overall. But in terms of their skill level, in terms of their placings and anything like that, the only outlier was the fall of 2016 when Magisk was one of the best players in the world, at least statistically.
Sure.
That was the one time they won Epicenter. And that's what it took for them to actually break through, because otherwise there's never been a difference. The reason that I decided to make roster moves that didn't involve changing MSL was because I think that if you look at this roster right now, there are some upgrades that you could make to the roster without removing MSL. And I think that he's the heart of the team in a similar way that if you look at Astralis now, obviously Device, Zipex, and Dupree are the heart of that team. If you were to remove one of those three, especially probably Device, it would be more important than replacing another player on the team. And MSL is been on that team forever. He's like groomed a lot of these players. And to me, I want to make sure that you can have the best possible Danish roster, except for the Astralis players, on this team to know exactly what MSL can do with the best roster possible before I'm comfortable removing him. Because while he certainly has his weaknesses, it's not clear to me that someone like Snappy, who he may be a significantly better in-game leader, but there's so much risk attached to that move that I don't feel comfortable doing it when there's some other moves that you could potentially do to improve the team. Maybe more.
Plus, there's also the factor that you have to consider in terms of like the plausibility of the move happening, which is that, first of all, like every time, it's funny, because of the results of North, we often end up only focusing on the negatives of MSL, but his strengths are largely what allow them to create the positive expectations that they then later on let you down on, because he so clearly defines the style of the team, how the players are used in it, etc. And so, as bad as they can be in as much as they will, you know, you can kind of bet your house that they'll lose that big semi-final or the big quarter-final. As much as that's the case, they actually do make the majority of playoffs, and they do have big results, and they do have a big best of one every now and then. And so it's hard to take someone who isn't outright failing and say, right, let's remove him entirely, rehaul the whole thing. So I can kind of see where you're coming from on that one, right? Just to quickly touch on how I opened the show. Are you someone where there's an allure to this team? There is sort of like some sort of an enigma about them, because, you know, if there are other teams that are good but not that great, like earlier this year, like that Hellraisers team briefly had some flair to it, you know, looked good at times. Gambit, except for the major, for me, were kind of like good to a point, but I never expected much more from them. You know, these teams actually aren't that alluring to me. I think they're more of a known quantity, you know. Is there some mystery or something that draws you in about North?
Yeah, I think about North, ever since they won Epicenter, is that you always felt that they were just one step away. You know, Hellraisers might have been a long ways away, even though they were at a similar level as North. With North, you look like, oh, maybe if they just had one more star player, or maybe if they were just a little better in this way, they could edge out these teams that they compete with so closely. And so there's something much more attractive with someone who's almost great, but isn't quite. And he ends up being mediocre compared to a simply mediocre team.
Yes. Well, another thing that I thought was interesting about your piece was you did actually try to ground it in being plausible. Like you just said there, obviously the goal is try and make a better North team, but without the Astralis players. Because yes, any kid who's a fan of Counter-Strike could go, well, imagine if you gave, you know, Device and Dupree over to MSL and then he got to choose which players he would play. Yeah, I'm sure, assuming he has the ability to make a championship team, this would be the quickest route to it, you know. This would be the route to, but that's not very plausible, either in terms of those players leaving or Astralis wanting to let them go, or North necessarily being in a position right now with where the two teams are to be able to broker such a deal. Odds are you're probably going to have to look outside of Astralis for the players you're going to bring in, but that obviously then makes it trickier because these two teams, that's obviously been another storyline of North, that they kind of are out of that position where it's like, you know, oh, if anyone gets good in our team, such as Config now, obviously, it's for sure that he'll go to Astralis and therefore will be reset again and we start over. Now, arguably, they've got a pretty solid group of players, and now they are also themselves a key destination for players to go within Denmark. So give us some insight then. So of the players you suggested, one of them that you picked out was Yugi from Heroic, who obviously is one of the more recent additions to even Heroic himself. He only came along this year, and Heroic itself as a team has been very up and down and hasn't really seen the same level of hope, optimism behind it as they had last year, because obviously the team last year was indeed the one that had Valde and had Glaive at some point in time, you know. So why Yugi? Why did you pick him as someone you thought was a viable pickup?
So I started with looking at Danish operas from the perspective of Cajun B, because none of the players. One of the frustrating parts about North is that they don't have a bad player on their team, but you feel like they're missing. They're still missing a significant amount of firepower, and so one of the obvious upgrades for me, considering the newfound kind of wealth of opping talent in Denmark, was to look at Cajun B, and Cajun B is a decent opper, but he's not good, and he can't compete with the best oppers in the world. So when you put him against a top team, if you put him against Fallen, Guardian, Kenny S, or Device, all those top 4 teams that North can't really beat, he can't have an impact, and his ADR goes way down. If you just look at him in game, he struggles to win those duels. He doesn't have an impact on T side at all. In fact, he's one of the worst T-side oppers in the game. Whether that's his fault or not, I can't know that. When I did my interview with MSL, he told me that he had a problem with that, and that might be something that he has difficulty with, which I think is certainly true, considering MSL has never had a star opera that I could think of on any of his teams. But Cajun B is just not that great of a player, and it seems like by keeping him as an opper, you're missing out on some other players that could be significant, not just a bit better, but significantly better. And so Yugi is the sort of the most obvious prospect, because he's actually faced top teams, unlike Mertz. Yugi's proven himself on LAN a lot more than Mertz has, and you've seen what he can do and how confident he can be against the best teams in the world, while I haven't seen Mertz do that. So Yugi was the first choice for those reasons. And I went to look at him in game, and he was, in terms of raw skill, he looked like an elite opper. He was excellent. His firing speed is ridiculous, and he's actually accurate when he fires fast, unlike some other top oppers. He's very mobile. I don't know if that's his decision or if that's Snappy's. When I talked to Snappy, he told me that he did have a sense of like, oh, I'm going to go here. I'm going to push through mid on Inferno, do some crazy shit. But that's definitely not his tendency, I would say. That's not what he does all the time. But the fact that he can do it, and the fact that he's so mechanically skilled, gives him a lot of flexibility in the way that a controlling in-game leader might want to manage him. And the reason I think that's so valuable for MSL is because MSL, as he told me, was struggling with using oppers aggressively. He has a problem creating strategies around that, or he doesn't feel comfortable giving them the space. And Yugi doesn't have to do that. Yugi can stand like a turd and get some amazing shots, or he can be very mobile and move like Device, or he can push and do some crazy shit like Kenny S might do. And so I think that the floor for Yugi is really high, because I think that at worst he'll be just as good an opera as Cajun will, and at best he'll be much better. He would actually be dominant. I don't think that he's the kind of player that will come in and immediately be one of the best players in the world or anything like that. He definitely has the skill to be that kind of player, but I get the sense that he needs to spend more time against top teams to learn the limits of what he can do and what he can get away with. I think I've seen him get caught in rotates quite a few times. I've seen him overplay his hand a little bit. But to me, the fact that he doesn't always do that, and the fact that he can stand around, he has the patience too, but he has also the willingness to go aggressive, unlike an opera like Skadoodle, makes him almost perfect for someone who's having trouble figuring out what he wants, in the case of MSL, what he wants an opera to look like on his team. And his rifles are serviceable. I don't know if they're excellent, but very few operas' rifles are excellent, and Cajun Bs aren't excellent, as long as I don't think they're a burden. So I think that he could be successful in gun rounds without an AWP as well. And he just looks like the most obvious upgrade out of any player on North. The only concern, I think, with adding him would be that Cajun B is a very vocal player, from what I've heard, and I don't get the sense that, I don't have this confirmed, but I don't get the sense that Yugi is a very vocal player. And I don't know how much Cajun contributes to North's ability to create executes or call mid-round or any of these things. So I don't know how much that it would deter, but it seems like the benefit of having someone so mechanically skilled and so fresh would be massively beneficial. And so to me, that seems like the most obvious move that North could make right now.
Is to get Yugi from Heroic.
Yes.
Yes. Well, the thing is, I can actually tell you that Cajun B is definitely a vocal player, but I think especially in the context that he's the sort of player who has in mind how he wants to play the game. And so I actually think I can tie that in somewhat to your point, which I think is quite astute, which that his flaw, funnily enough, in this sense, he represents North, which is that up and until against players and teams who are much better than him, he looks great. He's doing fine. Everything's working well, or he's having good games. He's having good stats. Therefore, his numbers certainly don't show that he's a bad player. But his problem is he's the sort of player who is going to get outclassed and in a fairly consistent manner by the AWPers that are better than him, just as North gets outclassed by the teams that are better than them. And so part of the flaw, I think, here is, first of all, within his team, as you say, MSL's never really had like the great AWPer to work with, like he wanted to when he had Nico with a C many years ago, but that was when that player was essentially quite washed up already, and they were just kind of praying that somehow he revived his career, and it didn't happen. So unfortunately, to me, this is an example of where MSL saw Cajun B over in Astralis as this like super sick hybrid AWPer who on the right map on the wrong side would go off, and notably, by the way, was one of those hybrid AWPers who really could decide when he wanted to use the AWP, which is a very key difference, because when you're having a bad game, then you don't pick it up and look bad. So the difference is, to MSL, he was like, it's almost like a band-aid solution. It's like, right, we don't have a really good AWP right now, but you can do it like quite a lot, right? Yeah, okay, cool. So you just play it on these maps. I guess in MSL's logic, like they only play the same couple of maps over and over again anyway. So, okay, learn these spots. The problem is there's a ceiling to what you can do with that. And there's a difference between serviceable and world championship level. And I think if you go and you look right now, I don't think it's a coincidence that the elite teams in Counter-Strike do not have a serviceable AWPer. They have the best AWPers. You literally look at the 3 or 4 teams you'd put ahead of North, they all have a better AWPer. So there's a logic to this, right? The issue here, obviously, is someone like Yugi, as you've just said, hasn't really had that much experience still against the top level. Plus, within his team, you could add in the expectation maybe isn't as high, like that he has to be amazing in all the games. You can probably get away with a lot more in that team. If they put him onto North, do they have to kind of craft it so he can be a star player in the team? Does he have to kind of be a focal point, as opposed to, like when Valde joined the team, you got the sense that he wasn't joining to replace Magus and be like the superstar Magus should have been. He was joined to be a good player, and, we're going to kind of build out more good players and hopefully we're going to win as a team. Should they, if they were to get, hypothetically, Yugi, should he be a main focal point of the team, do you think?
Well, I think he probably should be, because he would be one of the 2 most skilled players on that team. I don't think he would be, which is actually why I feel way more comfortable picking Yugi than Mertz, who's a very aggressive player. Because I think that if you just replaced everything that Cajun B does in-game with Yugi would do better than Cajun B does, because he's more skilled. He has better movement. He can get away with more things than Cajun B can on a simple mechanical level. And so I think that he would be just better if you just let him plug and play. What I think is great about Yugi is because he's flexible in this way, you can start there and then build a certain repertoire of strats. In the case of MSL, is probably what he would be comfortable with, or defaults in which you rely on Yugi to get picks, which is something that even if MSL felt comfortable doing this, I don't think that he should do that with Cajun B. I don't think that Cajun B is fast enough or good enough to, and with all due respect to him, good enough to dominate on a T side within AWP.
Well, if you look, he doesn't even try to really op-duel people. He tends to be the person who holds it on a corner and does a decent enough job at hitting the 70% shot,
Yeah, and I think that he knows that he can't do the other thing. Like, if you see him perform op duels against top 4 oppers, he loses. He almost always loses. He's not very fast, and so I think that you could actually just do more. I think that your floor would be just as high, if not higher, just by having a more skilled player. And your ceiling would be significantly higher, because then you have way more versatility in your T-side defaults. And on your CT side, you can have a very mobile and very skilled opper. And we see in teams like Astralis how much that can actually revolutionize your CT side. And so I think there's tons of potential there for North. I think that could actually, I think that the difference could make them win certain series. I don't know if it's enough to make them the best team in the world or consistently beat FaZe or SK, but I think it gives them a puncher's chance. And right now, even though they constantly get to 16-12s against good teams, it really doesn't feel like they have a puncher's chance. It feels like we've seen them get close too many times to actually believe that they'll beat one of these teams and win a tournament. And so I think that this would give them that ability. I'm not sure that it would be enough for them to break through in the total sense, but I think it would be a massive improvement on what they have right now.
Okay, so you kind of hinted at this, alluded to it when you made the contrast between why you would take Yugi over Mertz. But if you bring Mertz on board, probably have to some degree, we're not just making a player change here, we're probably making some sort of a fundamental change to North itself, right?
Yeah, so the risk attached to Yugi is financial risk, because you would need to buy him out of Heroic or wait a long period of time whenever his contract runs out. In the case of Mertz, he's on their academy team, and so financially there is absolutely no risk to bringing him up and trying him, and if it doesn't work, hey, we'll keep Cajun-B. So in that way, there's not much risk. But in terms of your gameplay, whenever I watch Mertz, he does some crazy shit, and that seems very anti-MSL. I don't know Mertz's temperament. I don't know if he has the patience, or that's just what he feels like he needs to do on a lesser team because he's better than the players around him. Maybe that's the case. But I do think that in that way, stylistically, it's not clear that Mertz can do what Cajun-B is doing right now. And we don't even know that MSL can do what can build a team around what Mertz is doing right now. And so there's significant risk attached to that. The other thing is that North Academy hasn't played any good teams. They're just not that high tier team. And so we haven't seen Mertz play against a bunch of really good teams. And an opera can look really different against top teams. If you have a particularly passive opera and he's playing against a team that actually uses utility properly, he's going to get way fewer picks because he can get smoked off. He's going to get mollied out of positions. He's going to be able to, he's going to get shut down. And if you have a player that plays too aggressively, that overplays his hand, he's going to get punished way more often. There's a difference between playing, someone like S-Tag or whoever that player is on Heroic, or Rain, right? Rain could actually beat an opera in a duel easily. He does it all the time. Sure. While players at a lower tier that Mertz is playing at might not. And so there's a significant risk stylistically, and also just skill-wise. It might be that he's just as good or better than Yugi is mechanically, but we haven't seen it. And so I don't think it would be safe to assume that. That said, obviously he's on North Academy. I don't think it hurts for them to try him for a LAN or two if they don't feel comfortable buying out Yugi financially.
Okay. So one of the interesting details of this article was if you actually got together all the world's experts and journalists, etc., I think you could get a lot of diverse sort of plans as to how you could change North, what they could do differently. Some people would probably stick with what they have and try and enhance it somehow with a player move. Some people, as I was alluding to here, maybe would break some of it up or go a different route, But one of the interesting things I thought was that you did land on the idea of let's remove Cajun-B, right? Is there a world in which you would have gone a different route? Like let's remove, could be any of the other players, and let's go with, for example, a pure rifler. Let's go with Nico with a K, the Danish one from Heroic, or let's go with someone else from another one of these teams, Ange, who's over in NRG or something. There's different routes you could go with this. Is that as viable? Is there a reason why you selected this as like this is the main model through which you were going to try and improve the North lineup?
Right. Well, there's two reasons for that. The first is that I think that of all the players, save for MSL, Cajun-B is the worst individual player. And so that makes him obviously, if you need to take anyone off, which roster move would impact North negatively the most, you'd probably see, or the least rather, you'd probably say Cajun-B. So immediately Cajun-B is it sounds better than saying I'm going to remove AZ or I'm going to remove Valde. It's easier for me to swallow because Cajun B's been a pro for a very, very long time, and he's a known quantity. I think at this point it would be amazing.
Is that another factor then? The idea that, like, you know, he's probably not going to become twice as good next year. He's probably going to be as good or perhaps worse.
Right. Well, yeah, that's very important because I'm operating under the assumption that MSL and his team is tired of getting top fours. Like, I don't think that he's been doing it for years now. I don't think that that's particularly satisfying for him. And so I think that the reason why I called it what can make North break through is because I think that they're really trying to break through, or they should want to break through into the tier 1, and that I think that they need a significant increase in performance from at least one player for that to change. And it's possible that AZ regains form. He already has slightly. AZ wasn't, at least I didn't think that AZ was a great player in the Magisk lineup. But I do think that he's perfectly serviceable now. I think he's a good rifler. And Valde is also a good player. I think he's a good clutcher and he's a good side anchor. And I think that we haven't seen everything that he can do yet. He's quite a new player. And so it could be that he improves from where we are now. And you can't remove Config because he's their best player. Now, if there was a star rifler in the Danish scene, I would feel more comfortable removing AZ. I think that Valde is a very useful player to have at his skill level as maybe not one of your star players, but as maybe your third or fourth best player in terms of mechanical skill. I think that everything other than mechanical skill, he's very, very good at. I think he's a very smart player, and he's a good clutcher, so I'd like to keep him there. AZ, I would be okay with removing if you could find a very good player, but you can't just replace someone. You can't just replace him with someone who might be good. And to me, looking at Nico, the Danish Nico, now he's struggled a little bit in the last few months. At the beginning of 2017, he was an incredibly strong performer statistically, and to the eye test, he has amazing aim, so he looks great all the time. But he's struggled to put those frags on the board, and to me, he looks like someone who hasn't quite figured out how to be consistent yet. And so he could end up being, in fact, if I had to bet, I would say he was a better player than AZ is in 2 years from now or a year from now. But right now, I don't know that it would make North better. In fact, there's a good chance that it would make them worse. And because of North being kind of an old team at this point, they're not like an up-and-coming team. I don't think that saying, oh, here's a project and you might become good maybe in a year is a satisfying answer. Yeah. Now, if that's all you can do, then sure, but I think that there's a better option and replacing Cajun with Yugi there.
Okay. Right. The impossible question that no one can answer, but yet must be posed to anyone who dares to step foot into this swamp is, do you think that North makes a change and does break through and somehow get more out of this team?
I think it depends. So whether or not they make a move, I think they will. It depends, like it did last time, on how they do with the major. If they don't, I know that MSL, after completely failing their last event, was like, we feel super motivated and we're going to do great. I mean, he always says that, so I hope it's true for his sake, but it's hard for me to believe that's going to lead to significant improvement on their part. I think that if they don't make top 4 at the major, they're going to take a deep, serious look at themselves. Because they haven't gotten better with this team. They look good when they first they went to Malmo, obviously. They did very well, and then they won DreamHack Montreal. But they still have the same issue that they did with the old roster. As soon as the major came and the Magisk wasn't an excellent player, where it's just they can't beat the top cluster of teams, and they still can't now. They don't beat them. Their win rate on CT side is 56% normally in gun rounds, and it's 38% against top 4 teams, which would be G2, SK, FaZe, and Astralis. You could say that G2 is not a top 4 team, but when you're talking about against North, they're definitely one of those top 4 because they always perform against North. They eat them alive. And so I think that they will make a move like they did last time. I don't feel like there was they weren't completely failing. Like, they made a roster, they removed Magisk after making a top 8 at the major. So it's clear that this is an ambitious team to me, and they will probably make a move. Whether it'll improve them, I think that if they get Yugi, there's a decent chance that they get better than they are now. I think that they could become a good team. I don't know if they could consistently beat SK or Astralis or maybe FaZe. That seems far-fetched for now, but I think that if getting Yugi, MSL explores different ways of creating tactics and makes North less predictable, because that's one of the things, that's one of their biggest weaknesses, especially against G2 and FaZe, is that whenever one of these players like Apex or Nico smell blood and smell a weakness in your default, or will just push through a smoke during an execute, they will single-handedly ruin your execute or your default and fuck you. And right now, North don't impose enough respect strategically and in terms of firepower to get players like that not to do it. And so you have players like Zipex that will counter-strat them and just crush them through wit, and then you have players mechanically like Apex that will eat them alive as well. I think that getting a player like Yugi will impose more respect and will give them the opportunity to become more diverse in the types of strats that they do, and I think that will improve their T side significantly. In terms of CT side, if you can get if MSL can learn to use Yugi in the way that someone like Glaive uses Device, I think that they would become a good CT side team, but I don't see them becoming a dominant CT side team against the top tier. So I guess that's a kind of... It depends on the kind of move they do. If they get Mertz, then I don't think they're going to get much better unless Mertz ends up being some kind of prodigy. It seems unlikely.
Hello, this is Neo, just an average CSGO player, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.